for a company. And customers were happy. Things were going pretty well. I felt like I was doing a good job. We recruited and hired some great people, and the team was happy. We had good workflows. We were using GitHub, good pipelines, and so our process felt efficient. And we had continual one-on-ones and retros, so people were constantly getting feedback on how they could improve. So things were going pretty well. I felt pretty good. But after a while, something started bothering me. I started feeling like we were plateauing. I didn't know if we were actually getting better. In fact, I didn't even know if we were good or if I was doing my job. I wasn't the only one interested in this question. My boss was too. He asked everyone on the leadership team of the company to start reporting how they were doing, metrics on how they were doing at our monthly meetings. And he specifically asked me to report on an indicator of what we were getting done, our team's productivity or output. And I protested. I told him I had never seen good metrics for doing this, and all the metrics that I knew of simply weren't good. He rebutted and told me, I don't care what the metric is, I don't care what the number is, but just give me some number. So I thought about it. And the more I thought, the more why wasn't there a metric I could use? Why didn't I have a way of measuring how well my team was doing? And why hadn't this problem already been solved? To try and find some answers, I reached out to some mentors of mine. And the first person I talked to was a CTO. He'd been a CTO for over 20 years, managed hundreds of engineers. And when I asked him, how do you measure the productivity of your team? He told me it was impossible. He told me we were actually flawed in even asking that question. I spoke to another mentor, and he told me he was trying to figure out how to develop something like MBA plus minus, effectively a way of measuring the value a team member is contributing. But he had no way of figuring out how to actually calculate it. I spoke to some other mentors, and they were all at a loss also. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These companies were spending tens of millions of dollars on their engineering teams, yet they had absolutely no way of tracking or measuring how well they were doing, let alone whether they were getting better or worse. And this seemed crazy to me. In every other profession, sports, marketing, sales, right? There are established ways of measuring how your organization is doing and how it can improve. And in fact, most of these methods are generated through software. Ironically, in the field of software development, we haven't solved this problem. We don't have established ways of measuring how well we're doing or whether we're getting better or worse. I thought to myself, there had to be a way, and I was determined to figure it out. So my name is Abi, and I've spent the past several years figuring out what kinds of metrics can work on software teams and how metrics can be used in ways that positively transform teams and behaviors. I work at GitHub now. Before I worked at GitHub, I started a company called PullPanda. And at PullPanda, we developed a product called Pull Analytics, which provided various metrics and analytics for teams. Now I'm working at GitHub with an unbelievable team to bring these capabilities to the rest of the world. And today I'm going to tell you some lessons from my journey in trying to figure out how to measure developer productivity and some tips for how you can gain value out of using metrics on your teams. So a few months after I'd spoken to my mentors, I actually quit my job to work on this problem full time. And I quickly realized that metrics are a really hard problem. Of course, that's why they haven't been solved yet. And the thing is that there are so many things in software engineering that we can measure, but very few that I think we should. It took me a while to realize this. I spoke with many companies, read up on all the literature, and looked at all the products out there. And I also spent a lot of time talking with my dad. See, my dad is a retired software developer, and if there's one thing that developers and dads share in common, it's that they have a lot of opinions and they like to voice them. And I'll tell you more about my dad in a minute. So, one of the first metrics I looked at was commits, right? GitHub already had different charts and graphs on commits, so it seemed like something that was pretty easy to count. I knew it wasn't going to be the perfect metric, but I thought, hey, maybe this might be useful. And for starters, having no metrics is sort of a red flag, right? In software, we're constantly committing code. So if there are no commits, that means no work is getting done, and that's a problem. This metric is sounding awesome already. And it gets even better. So I spoke with a lot of developers and teams, and we all sort of agreed that in general, having small, frequent commits is better than having infrequent, large commits, right? It means you're continually deploying changes. These changes are easier to manage. And so with this metric, if you increase the number of commits you have, you in effect are also influencing your process such that you are committing smaller changes more frequently, right? So this metric is just sounding great. I thought I was on something, so I showed some CTOs this metric and explained my rationale, and they told me it sounded pretty good. And one night I was having a family dinner, and my dad was there, and I told him about it, and he told me it was garbage. He told me that this is an awful idea and that no developer would ever want to be measured by this sort of thing. And you see, my dad had been a developer for over 30 years before he retired. And throughout his career, he had countless experiences where managers had rolled out bad metrics and ruined their teams and made developers' lives miserable. It had been terrible. And he told me that tracking commits was a terrible idea. For one thing, just tracking the number of commits doesn't tell you anything about the actual value being delivered. And if someone wanted to, they could easily game it just by committing extra commits, and this wouldn't help the team. So if you can't tell already, my dad was super sensitive about metrics. So sensitive, in fact, that he would blanketly reject almost any idea I pitched him on in terms of metrics. I'd tell him, Dad, hey, how about this metric? Or how about this one? And blanketly, he would just shake his head and tell me that the problem I was working on was impossible. And he made me feel like I was speaking of evil or blasphemous things. So the tension between us was rising, and one evening it erupted. So I was at home. I was actually reading the book Accelerate, which is an awesome book that analyzes high-performing teams and suggests some metrics that can be used for benchmarking your organization. Anyways, I was reading this book and stumbled across, well, there were a lot of great ideas in that book, but I was reading something and thought it was a great idea. And I was working at home at my parents' house, and my dad walked in. I think he had been at the grocery store, and I said, hey, Dad, check this thing out that I just read. And again, he just shook his head at me and dismissed me. And so I jutted back. I said, what are you talking about? What's your problem? Anyways, this kind of turned into a verbal boxing match to the point where at one point he looked at me and said, Abi, you're not the Einstein of engineering metrics. And given that I was at this point devoting my life to figuring this out, I was a bit offended. And so I started yelling at him, and our fight escalated to the point where I had to leave the house. So neither of us are proud of that moment, but the more I think back to that conflict, the more I think of it as a reminder of just how emotional this topic is for both developers and managers. Right? My story at the beginning of this talk of not having a way to measure, that was a powerful emotion. And similarly, for my father, who time after time to negative experiences with metrics, his fear and opposition to metrics was also really powerful. And I think this is understandable, right? We all know that metrics can be used, if misused, can harm our culture, our processes, and they can make developers' lives miserable. And it's not just choosing the wrong metrics that does this, it's also how we use metrics on our teams. So there are a lot of ways that metrics can harm our teams, and one obvious example would be if a manager were using a metric like commits to reward or punish people on their team. Right? This is not a good practice. Don't do this. But there are less obvious ways in which metrics can also harm our teams. And in fact, even good metrics can be harmful when they're manifested or presented. Let me go into an example. So this is one of the features we built in Panda. It shows the average code review turnaround time for everyone on your team, ranked from lowest to highest. And I actually think code review turnaround time is a great metric, and I'll talk more about it later. But, and just for clarity, code review turnaround time is the time between someone on your team requesting a review and the reviewer responding. So take a look at this page and ask yourself, what kinds of negative behaviors do you think started occurring when teams started viewing this? It was actually really surprising to me. Thank you. So there were a couple behaviors that I started observing that were really interesting. So one thing that happened is because teams started trying to turn around reviews more quickly, a lot of teams observed that people weren't actually doing real reviews. They were just rubber stamping reviews in order to get them done, but the quality of those reviews had really slipped. And this, of course, wasn't good. Another really interesting consequence of this feature was that the time here, the calculation of the time doesn't include weekends. And so what started to end up happening is that teams would stop requesting code reviews on Fridays because they knew that it would mess up their stats, right? Because people wouldn't be able to get to them until Monday. And so again, these weird behaviors started occurring on teams. And it wasn't because this metric in of itself is bad. It was because of the way they were presented and manifested in Panda. So we've looked at a couple ways metrics can backfire. And this is really important because, again, to be successful, you not only have to choose the right metrics and measure the right things, but you also have to design the way you present metrics in the right ways. A moment ago, I talked about how commits is a problematic metric, but it's not the only one that spells trouble. I think there are 5 common metrics that I see companies using all the time as a way of measuring output or productivity, and I call these the flawed 5. In a moment, I'll walk through these, but first, I've said the word productivity throughout this talk, but we haven't really defined what it means in the context of software engineering. And I have a funny story about this. I'd spent a lot of time pondering this question, and a few months ago, I was in a meeting, and I asked everyone in the room to share their definition of what productivity meant. One person raised their hand and suggested that it be measured similar to GDP. In other words, maybe the profit or yield per engineer in a company. And I thought to myself, that's interesting, but it sounds kind of agricultural. We're not building farms here, we're building software. And after this meeting, I kept thinking about this. And when I went home that night, I actually just Googled the definition of productivity. And funny enough, the definition that came up was the state or quality of producing something, especially crops. I thought this was really funny. I guess that person was spot on. And of course, it left me even more confused about what the correct definition of productivity is in software development. And I've asked many developers and leaders this question, and I get all kinds of different responses. But by far the most common response I get is how much are we getting done, right? Output. And this makes sense, because after all, in software development, we produce things, and so it's logical that we want to measure how much we're producing. But I think the problem in software development is that we can't measure how much we're producing, right? Software development is not like a factory assembly line where you can just count up the number of widgets that are being produced and easily determine how much they cost. I think that software development is more like art, right? In art, just throwing more paint on the canvas isn't necessarily better. And similarly, in software, just doing more things or producing more lines of code or creating more commits is often the opposite of what we want to be doing in software. And similarly, it might take an artist a whole day just to figure out the perfect brushstroke to add to their painting. And in software, we all know that even really small changes in terms of lines of code, right, can take an immense amount of time and effort to figure out. So in software, we can't really measure output. But unfortunately, that doesn't stop people from trying. And those flawed 5 metrics I referred to earlier, that's what they all share in common. They're all metrics that are used to try to measure output, to try to measure productivity, and they don't work. So we'll go through them. So number of lines of code is a metric that's been around ever since people started writing software. And it's a really bad measure of productivity, right? For starters, there's different languages, different formatting conventions. So 3 lines of code in one language might be 20 lines of code in another. So it's really difficult to even compare. On top of that, I think any good software developer knows that when you're refactoring code or writing good code, what you're actually trying to do is create less code, right? And so when you use lines of code as a metric, as a way of measuring output or productivity, you actually incentivize the opposite programming practices and behaviors we want to build good software. Unfortunately, is still a really common metric. It's used many different companies in our industry. In fact, just a couple months ago, I came across a company that was stack ranking developers based on the number of lines of code they wrote and actually firing people who rank low. And I think we all in this room recognize that that's a terrible practice that needs to stop. But again, it's surprising and unfortunate how common this still is in our industry. And we need to move away from this. Another metric I see that's more recent being used to measure productivity is pull request count. And counting pull requests seem to be a recent trend. I was at a meetup last year, and a manager told me, I think pull request count is the new vanity metric. And I completely agree with him. Counting pull requests is a vanity metric, right? It doesn't take into account the size or difficulty of those pull requests. And really, at the end of the day, all it tells you is just how many pull requests were created. So like lines of code, this metric can encourage actually negative behaviors on your team, right? You don't want developers unnecessarily creating an excessive number of pull requests just to inflate their metric. And this is what happens when you incentivize or reward developers based on a metric like this. I've actually seen this metric become really common in our industry, and this is just one example. This is actually GitLab's engineering OKRs, and it's published on their website. And in this OKR, they state that their objective is to improve productivity by 60%, and they intend to measure this and achieve this by increasing the number of merge requests, pull requests created per engineer by 20%. I don't think this is a good practice. I think counting pull requests may seem less offensive and less obviously wrong than counting lines of code, but they both suffer from the same problems. So another one is velocity points. And I think velocity points can be an unpleasant subject. I think a lot of developers just see them as a necessary evil. I'm personally a big fan of velocity points. I think that when used as designed, they're a fantastic estimation tool and something you can use to forecast delivery on your team. I think you run into problems, though, when you try to turn velocity from a forecasting and estimation tool into a measure of productivity or output. When you reward people or teams based on the number of points they're delivering, this immediately jeopardizes the accuracy of the estimates they provide because they're incentivized to inflate the number of points things take, just to inflate the number of points they deliver. And when this happens, velocity points ends up just being a meaningless metric. So as soon as you take velocity points and start using it as a measure of output or productivity, it becomes useless for its actual design purpose. So finally, there's a new metric it's a new proprietary metric that a lot of the leading vendors providing engineering analytics tools have built into their products, and it's called impact. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, impact is essentially lines of code, but it also factors in other things like how many different files were touched, or and what amount of code that was changed was new versus existing code. And all these factors are combined to create what is called an impact score. I've observed many companies that have tried to use this metric, and in almost all cases, developers have hated it, right? And not only does this metric suffer from the same flaws as lines of code, but it's also really difficult to understand. There's so many things that go into calculating this that it becomes inactionable. And lastly, I think there's a pretty big problem with the naming of this metric. By calling it impact, it suggests, especially to executive and managers, on how this metric should be used. And it sends a strong signal that this be an end-all, be-all way of evaluating and measuring the value of developers. And if you recall the story about my dad, this is exactly the type of thing that upset him and drove him nuts. So just to recap, these are the flawed 5 metrics, and all these metrics are ways that I see companies trying to measure output in order to measure productivity, and they don't work, right? They're not accurate. They incentivize negative behaviors on teams. And as I've done research on this, one question I've had is, why is it that so many companies, so many people use these metrics despite their flaws? Why is it, why does this keep happening? And if you recall that story I shared at the beginning of the talk about me being a manager and not being able to measure, that frustration I felt was really powerful. And I've spoken, and as many people across our industry, I found that this is a really common desire and need that people share. I've met with leaders who are in charge of thousands of engineers, and they have absolutely no idea what's going on, let alone how well they're doing. I've spoken with open source maintainers of top projects in the world who have no idea whether their communities are healthy, whether they're growing, or what the impact of their projects even are. And these are all scenarios where measurement would be incredibly useful, but where today there aren't really good ways of doing so. And I think it's this burning desire, this desperation, that leads us into the trap of measuring the wrong things or using metrics in the wrong way, even when we see the flaws. So to help prevent ourselves from falling into these traps, I think we need to better understand ourselves. We really need to understand why we want to measure. And this why is really important. I think understanding this why helps us recognize our own biases and avoid the traps that I've talked about. I think that in almost all cases, our desire to measure falls into 4 core reasons, and I'll go through them. I think the first and obvious reason we want to measure is to prompt action or inform our decisions. I was week talking with an engineering manager who was really concerned about reviews being distributed on their team in uneven ways. And so what he wanted was some sort of code, how many reviews everyone on the team had assigned in real time so that their team could use that to determine who should get the next code review. There are lots of different cases like this. For example, maybe in open source, I talked to a lot of maintainers who just want a way to quickly diagnose what are open things that haven't been responded to or work that's gone stale that needs to be followed up on. And so again, very common case is just what do I need to do? Another reason I see is that all organizations, all teams need some way of creating alignment for determining what is it we're trying to do and how can we measure whether we're actually doing it, right? So I'm sure on all your teams, you're familiar with things like OKRs. And really, when you're setting goals and doing something like OKRs, right, you need some way to actually quantify and quantitatively express your goal and verify that you're actually achieving it. And this is another common use case I see for why teams and executives and developers want to measure. Uh, this one's one of the most interesting to me. I was just talking to an engineering leader who was telling me a story. He told me, that he was asking the board for $10 million, a $10 million investment in his organization to increase headcount and procure some new tools. And to ask for this, he had to be able to actually show that this investment would improve their organization, right? And I think this happens all the time. Even as myself as a manager, when I went to my boss and asked for more budget to hire, I needed something to be able to point to justify this additional investment I was asking for. Another example of this would be, engineering leader maybe making a decision, a process change on your team, on their team, and they need a way with numbers to actually advocate and justify and confirm that this is having a positive effect. And I think this is actually one of the most dangerous reasons why we measure, because in all these situations, we know what we want to do, and we end up going fishing for a number that we can use to help sell what we're trying to do. And in these situations, it's easy to settle for a metric that may not be meaningful at all, but just helps us tell our story. And actually, it's funny because we see that similar problem with GitHub itself. Companies ask us all the time, show us how GitHub is improving our organization. And in those conversations today, into many of the similar problems where we see companies creating all kinds of different numbers and metrics that oftentimes don't mean a lot in order to justify their investment, increases investment in GitHub. Lastly, all of us in the work we do, we all aspire to have a higher purpose in what we're doing. We all want to understand what is the impact that our work is actually having on the world. And this is a theme that comes up most when I talk to open source developers who are investing all this time into their projects, into their communities, yet they don't really know whether all this work, what it's going for. And I think this is also true for us as individual software developers, or for those of us who lead teams. We want to feel good about the work we do, and to do that, we really need to understand, what is the value we're delivering at the end of the day. And again, this is so higher purpose is another reason why I think we all want to be able to measure things. So I've talked a lot about the flawed 5 metrics that don't work. My father, who is fearful and opposed to any metrics. But I do want to share some hope. I do want to talk about some ways I found, some cases where I found metrics do work and can provide value to your teams. I think there are really 3 core as to making metrics work on your team. The first is to measure process, not output. And I'll talk more about this in a minute. And the other 2 I'll go into examples on, but the first is to always measure against targets versus measuring absolute numbers. And finally, to never measure individual metrics, especially historical metrics. So when people ask me, how do you measure productivity? How do you measure performance of an engineering organization? The question I ask them is, well, what does a high-performing organization even look like, right? What does it mean to be productive? And I think what we know it doesn't mean, right, when you picture a high-performing organization, I don't think what we picture is an organization that's writing many lines of code or creating many pull requests or has a high velocity count, right? I think when you think of a productive organization, what I picture is a team that is being responsive to one another, that is collaborating efficiently, right? That has really efficient process. And this is the response I give to people who ask this question. I tell them that when we really want to measure productivity The trap is to try to measure output. But we just looked at how our ways of measuring output don't really work. And so what I think a better way is to measure process. When you measure process and when you improve process, what you ultimately do is increase productivity. And so it's really another means to the same end of increasing productivity. And these are some examples of process metrics. I think what's really cool about process metrics is that as developers, we really care about this stuff. These are all things that directly impact the day-to-day developer experience. And when we measure these things, we not only improve the experience for developers, but we also have concrete numbers that we can use to show that our organizations are improving. So I think measuring process is the best thing we can measure today to measure and increase productivity. They give us a great tool to align organizations from top to bottom to provide executives and managers with something they can use to quantitatively express improvements on their team, while at the same time creating improvements in the day-to-day experience of developers. So number 2 on the list was to measure against arguments versus absolutes. This is a chart from PollPanda. It shows the average, well, it shows a breakdown of code review turnaround times on a team. And what I found with a lot of process metrics is that it's interesting to be able to see what your average code review turnaround time is or how it's trending. That's interesting to see, but it's really not that useful. And as I showed earlier with that leaderboard, right, it can also incentivize negative behaviors. I think that a better approach is to measure all these metrics against targets that you define, right? No two teams are the same, even within an organization. And so I think the best approach for using these metrics is to allow every team in an organization to define a target. So in this example, this is saying team is setting a goal of 24 hours as their goal for code review turnaround time. And then instead of measuring just what the average time for code reviews is, what you're measuring is what is our success against the goal we've defined, right? So I think this is a much more useful way of using these metrics. It also prevents those negative behaviors we looked at. And I think this metric is also useful for executives and managers because it provides a really simple snapshot into how your team is doing and not measured by a subjective interpretation of whether a number should be higher or lower, right? But what this number tells you is how is the team doing against the goal they set? And the final piece is going back to what we talked about earlier. I've seen almost no cases where measuring individual developer stats and showing a historical number for individual developer stats is beneficial, or at least beneficial enough to counteract the negative behaviors and they can introduce on our team. I found that just the mere presence of individual metrics can influence teams negatively in powerful ways. That was the example we looked at earlier. And so when you're starting on a journey of using metrics on your team, I would advise you to measure teams, measure metrics based on team, but not individuals. All right, that's it. Well, thank you very much. You can find me on Twitter at Avi if you want to talk about metrics. And I'll be up here taking questions after the talk.